The third area that is crucial is infrastructure. Africa's infrastructure is the weakest in the whole world in terms of road penetration, rail, port facilities, container ports, and of course electricity, which is total electricity for the 860 million people of sub-Saharan Africa is equivalent to the electricity of a modest-sized European country or less. And so all of this infrastructure needs a major scaling up, and this is a great opportunity, in my view, for business development. The international institutions have some role to play, but this is going to be privately financed if it's going to come through. And some of the big infrastructure now is being developed in conjunction with mining and hydrocarbons projects. Vale will put in probably some thousands of kilometers of rail for their big mining projects. And that can be multi-use facilities. And so we're working with them so that the infrastructure really is cross-national, it's networked, and it's multi-purpose, not enclave-based development. And then the fourth area that I mentioned is basically population stabilization. We need to get the total fertility rates down in Africa down to under 3, certainly within the next 10 years, but I think it could be done even within the next 5 years. I believe that family planning and birth control can be introduced comprehensively very quickly if it's part of a general strategy that includes child survival, clinical health services, schools for young children, and women's empowerment. That may sound like a lot, and it may sound like too much to do, but I actually believe that it's possible to make a breakthrough in this area in a relatively short period of time. So if I could sum up, technology and China and world markets are working for us. African governance is working in the right direction, but Africa is also being visited by the harms from outside of climate change and the dangers from inside of demographic explosion. And if those two risks can be brought under control, then I believe, in fact, that Africa is at the verge of its sustained breakout of extreme poverty. Let me pause there and say thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, Jeff.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. This is Fred Sonic. I'm with the African Leadership Academy. And I'll just moderate the next 15 minutes of question and answer with you.
Wonderful.
So there are mics in the room, which means that theoretically you should be able to ask a question from anywhere that you're sitting. But if for some reason, but we'd ask if you could please speak up when you ask your question. But if for some reason Jeff can't hear you, then I'll repeat the question for him from here. So. Yeah, we'd like to open it up for any questions down in the room.
Could you ask the relationship with China? I've read a lot about investment into Africa. Kind of curious from China's perspective, how they view that partnership, and then from Africa's perspective, how they view that partnership.
Yeah, I got the question. So I think that on the whole, this is viewed as a mutually beneficial relationship, but it's obviously fraught with questions. China is interested in two main things. It's interested in secure access to African commodities, without question, hydrocarbons, minerals, and perhaps agriculture. And it's also interested in geopolitical positioning. Africa, as a continent as a whole, is 54 countries, and this is a major diplomatic region, and China, I believe, has significant diplomatic interests in Africa as well. From the African side, China offers real capital, real investment, real capacity to do projects. And China's running circles around the United States, for example. We're barely present, whereas every place I go, there are Chinese crews that are building roads, building stadiums, building power plants. It's unbelievable. The United States has no presence that I can see other than in a few very specific areas. AIDS and malaria is the most important, and that's nice, very nice. But China has a huge presence in infrastructure. There have been frictions, no doubt. In part, China brings its own workers, which is extraordinary because there's a lot of employment potential in this, but China often brings thousands or tens of thousands of workers for these projects, and that's been a point of contention. Chinese competition in textiles and apparel, of course, is another source of some friction. And our governments complain a lot about China's investment because, China isn't part of the club of World Bank, IMF, and what we call good governance. But I'm not too fooled by that. This is basically commercial competition. I'm not sure whose governance is very good in this. Africa's going to have to look after itself, not depend on the goodwill or the good governance of outsiders, because every place is angling for oil, every place is angling for contracts, and I don't see much of a difference between China's behavior and America's behavior or anybody else's behavior for that matter. So on the whole, I think this is a fruitful and successful relationship that China and African countries are forging. I think China is going to be investing heavily in this, and I expect it to grow. And again, what I find extraordinary is how absent America is from this. This is going to be a growing market. It's important geopolitically. It is important socially, but the U.S. Plays a relatively little role, except in a few areas.
Any other question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Eva Meyerson-Milgram, and I work here at SIEPR. I'm Eva Meyerson-Milgram. I work here at SIEPR. And what I'd like to ask you, Jeff, thank you for a wonderful presentation. We educate a lot of people in Africa right now, and they come out highly educated to
Could you wave?
labor markets that do not work.
Oh, there you are. Good.
Can you see me?
Yes.
We educate, or Africa educates a lot of well-educated students by now. They come out to labor market as engineers, or physicists, accountants, and so on. Part of the problem is that the labor markets don't really work. Labor markets might be driven by clan mentality, by corruption, or just plainly no work. And of course that must be politically highly explosive. And that might lure other opportunities or alternatives out there. What's your take on what we do with labor markets in Africa and how they should be better working?
Great. Well, I actually think we're on the verge of a general revolution in education, reflected by this Skype this morning. I think that everything can change in how we deliver education as educators, and that the ability to reach children and young people who were excluded will rise dramatically in future years. Of course, we have to focus on making that happen, both public sector and private sector. I'm part of something called the Broadband Commission of the United Nations, which is bringing the IT industry, and that's a lot of you people, into these challenges. So I would like to see broadband connectivity in all schools, from primary school onward. I'd like to see international curricula. I'd like every school, from the tiniest little village school, to have an electronic library immediately, at least in the cloud, that can be accessed as a normal part of any child's education. I think we can close a lot of the gap that is vast right now, but the gap can be closed because of technology. So I'm a huge technology optimist in this regard. I see this as playing a very big role. It's changing, by the way, I don't know how John feels about it, but I found that the changes in the way I teach over the last 3 years are vastly bigger than over the preceding 27 years. And I think probably over the last 2,700 years, frankly. We can't just stand in front of a blackboard anymore and with the chalk and do something. Everything is changing. So I believe if we're creative, the education gap can be closed. Now, I'm also, in general, a kind of supply-sider in this regard, that as human skills rise, as education levels rise, we're going to see created tens of millions or hundreds of millions of good jobs in Africa because there's so much to do in so many sectors. And I don't really feel that it's a broken labor market. I feel it's a broken skills market that has been the biggest obstacle right now, and I think that that can be overcome. One of the things we're working on, just as one little example, is training and deploying 1 million community health workers in rural Africa by the year 2015. And a gentleman from Intel this morning offered some help on Intel's training the trainers model, which has reached millions of teachers in recent years in the context of this broadband commission, which I mentioned. And I think we will be able to train 1 million community health workers to be serious suppliers of community-based health care in a very short period of time, and then empowered by their mobile phones and by expert systems which link them to clinics and to emergency transport and other systems. So I see development as a system to begin with, or a system of systems, and I think that IT empowers these systems, and I think that education and health will be hugely empowered, and that the labor market will be able to develop and absorb millions of young people who are much better trained because of the way that technology will permit.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a question about renewable energy and solar energy, and in terms of infrastructure development. Sorry, can you hear me now? I have a question about renewable energy and solar energy, and in terms of infrastructure development, how is that being integrated into development right now?
This is a great question. As you know, it is shocking to this moment that I can't give you an accurate number, but maybe 80% of African villages, maybe it's 70%, are off the grid without electricity right now. So you go to rural Africa, you still see very large swaths of population and area without electricity. And yet Africa, at least part of Africa, not equatorial Africa, but both the Sahel and the drylands in southern Africa across Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, and so forth, have tremendous solar potential that has not been deployed so far. And I think that renewable energy, therefore, plays a role not only for a green economy, but for an electrified economy. But it hasn't really been developed significantly. Hydro is really the only renewable energy source that is heavily deployed. And biofuels, at least under the current arrangements, I fear basically compete with ecosystem services, so I'm not too much of a believer in a major scale-up biomass-based energy resources. I think we should be looking at other solutions.